Good morning, everyone. We're continuing with our Live Like Yogananda series from Swami Kriyananda's chapter 17 of the biography of Yogananda that he wrote, Salient Characteristics of the Master. Let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Guru, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to all. Help us to feel your presence. Give us the freedom of attunement so that we may move through this life courageously and happily, knowing that we are being guided inwardly by your wisdom and by your love. We are your children. Guide us and bless us in all that we do. Om. Peace. Amen. So, we are now quality number 17, which is sort of a lot of different points flowing together. Master had a strong, deep voice filled with power. There was no self-abasement in his humility. There was a suggestion rather of his attunement to the power of the universe, yet there was lightness also. That's a lot of different points in one paragraph. I'm going to read that again. Master had a strong, deep voice filled with power. There was no self-abasement in his humility. There was a suggestion rather of his attunement to the power of the universe, yet there was lightness also. One night at the monks' retreat at 29 Palms in California, I was suddenly awakened by a feeling of a great divine presence in the room. I was sleeping along with several other men on the floor of the living room. At once I sat up to meditate. Then I looked out the front window and saw the Master walking slowly outside. Instantly I got up, went out, and touched his feet. Later he commented with a smile, "I thought I was seeing a ghost." When Swami wrote this book, this biography, it wasn't carefully calculated. He didn't make outlines. He didn't have lots of notes. He just wrote it from inspiration from start to finish. He wrote it very quickly. He wrote it from what he already knew. He didn't write it from what he researched and found out. There's another biography of Yogananda. Surprisingly, there aren't very many. And it was written, it's a good book. It was written by a journalist, Phil Goldberg. And it's full of detailed facts of Master's life, it's fascinating in that respect. He was here at this time, he did that, this is what happened to him. It's an extraordinarily valuable resource, but it couldn't be more different it just couldn't possibly be more different from this one than it is, because he was a journalist, he researched it. He brought together information that hadn't been brought together, a great service. Swami wrote this completely out of his friendship, his relationship, his lifetime of study and knowledge of who Master was. So when Swami's writing, he's just writing in this flow of trying to put across to us, not only informationally, but vibrationally, what Master is and who Master was. So I'm just so, and it would organize itself. So I'm looking at these 3 paragraphs, and partly I'm seeing it as a writer and as an English teacher. I'm not an English teacher, but I sort of have those samskars, because he says here, and okay, this is also for us. Master had a strong voice filled with power. So I think I'm going to be hearing about Master's voice. There was no self-abasement in his humility. Okay, let's start with that, Because when you think of someone as being humble, you think of them as sort of not really wanting to assert themselves very much and sort of always talking a little softly, and everybody has to say, "What did you say? What did you say?" It's just sort of like, well, that's what it is to be humble, is, like this. And of course, many people who are very humble are virtually silent. They don't feel they have anything to say. But Master had a strong voice filled with power. When he spoke, he didn't sort of like, maybe I shouldn't, maybe I don't really want to impose my ideas on you. Maybe you really don't want to hear. That's not humility, that's self-abasement. I'm not really important. Nobody really wants to know about me. My ideas aren't very good. That's not humility, that's self-preoccupation. That's the opposite side of thinking you're important, is that thinking you're unimportant. But both of them are false, because we're all equally important in the eyes of God. That's why Master defined humility as self-honesty, which is, it just is what it is. There's nothing either to be ashamed of or to be proud of. It just is what it is. So Master expressed his humility without the slightest trace of self-abasement, because he knew who he was. He knew that he had this mission, and he just carried it out. The humility was in his he was completely impersonal. It didn't make him important. It didn't make him better than anybody else. It was just the mission that he was given to do. I was reading in a book about Anandamoyi Ma recently, and and it was, she didn't have a high, it said she didn't have a high or a low opinion of herself. She had no opinion of herself. There was just no consciousness of self. That's what Master said too when someone praised him for his humility. How can there be humility when there is no consciousness of self? So then Swami goes on to say, there was a suggestion rather of his attunement to the power of the universe. See, what happens to us when we really know who we are and we really overcome the ego is that we don't become, the ego becomes nothing, but the self becomes attuned to the power of the universe. And so the self can work miracles. The self can walk on water. The self can calm the storm. The self can raise the dead. It's the divine self, though. That's where the power is, and the more of that power that flows through, the more conscious one becomes, as Master describes it, as Swami describes it, that it has nothing to do with me. I used to watch with Swamiji, and people were so funny. Swami would achieve something or do something or give a wonderful talk or create a marvelously inspiring Christmas celebration. And people would say, "Oh, Swamiji, that was so well done. That was such a great talk." And he would say, "God is the doer." Or he would say, "Master spoke through me," or whatever, however he would say it. And then people would say, "Yes, but God has to have an instrument and you were the instrument." And they would work so hard, some people, to make sure that Swami knew that he was personally involved. And he would just be so like, of course I wasn't. And I began to see it in this way, which is the more powerful and appropriate and pleasing and capable you are, the less you are. And so what people compliment you for is what you didn't do. And when you do it yourself, nobody likes it much because it doesn't have the power of the universe behind it. So naturally, because our voice recognition is one of those advancements in identity protection, because the voice is unique. Everybody's voice is unique. And you can hear, people that you know, they say barely a word. My friend Seva, with whom I was a constant companion for my first decade at Ananda. I could tell by her breath, by her sneeze, I could tell what her mood was, because even every Om sound, every way that the Om came through her was uniquely imprinted. with her vibration. So Master, who is freed of all ego involvement, whose consciousness is one with the divine, what kind of a voice would he have except a voice that had that kind of power coming through it? There are voice recordings of Master now. There's many more available than there used to be. Voices of him singing and of him speaking. And sometimes when you have visualized him in your mind and you hear his voice for the first time, it can be a little startling because he doesn't hold back. His humility is not that he's soft-spoken. His humility is that he speaks the truth. And he speaks for the divine, and there's a feeling in his voice of his attunement to that power. But then Swami adds, yet there was lightness also. Because sometimes when we would think of a voice, strong voice that's filled with power, you would think, lo, I speaketh from the mountain, and these are my words. And sometimes when you see bad acting, or even, what you would call humorous parody acting, you always have the spiritual person always talks like he's at the bottom of a big steel tub and is sort of shouting up from the tub, and his voice is echoing. And sometimes it's actually presented somewhat seriously that way, because people don't understand. I remember there's there are various films about Jesus Christ. Some people are very fond of some of them. I don't really have an opinion, but I do remember one in which Jesus, I'm not sure whether he raised the dead or made the blind see or whatever it was, but the way he performed the miracle, his body was all squinched up and he was sort of like this, and he actually sort of broke out in a sweat with the effort, of making the blind to see. That's not how it is. I mean, I don't work miracles, but I know that isn't how it's done. Swami Kriyananda visited Satya Sai Baba, who was a very well-known spiritual person in India. And Sai Baba was known for manifesting things. And when Swami was there, he manifested for Swami a crystal mala, a mala made out of clear crystal beads. It's what Swami wore for quite some time. And he said when Baba would manifest things, he said it was just, there was no break in the flow of his energy. It wasn't like, lo, give me a minute here, I need to manifest this mala, and then everything would squinch up and then there would be the mala. Swami said it would be just as easily as if he just picked it up from the table. He would just turn his hand and there it was. Because the power that's being used is not individual, egoic, personal power. The center of the ego in the astral anatomy, in the spiritual anatomy, is at the medulla. And the medulla and the spiritual eye are the opposite poles of the same chakra. This is our individuality. The medulla is our individuality tied to our separateness from spirit. The spiritual eye is our individuality offered into the spirit until we become one with the spirit. That's a very simple explanation. But it's very interesting when you watch sometimes performers and entertainers, or you see someone on television or somewhere like that. People who are very egoically inclined they're often tossing their heads around a great deal. And sometimes their heads are even tilted back. This is where because the tension in the medulla pulls the head back a little. This is where the expression that someone who's proud and kind of snooty looks down their noses at people is because the tension in the medulla pulls the head back. And I saw some, this was many years ago, a great many celebrities got together, well-known singers and entertainers, and they made a recording of a song that was called "We Are the Children." It was some moment in history when great affirmation of unity was required. And it was a very well-intentioned and nicely done effort. And they put out a recording, and then they put out a video of them doing this recording. And I don't even remember the names, but it was many of the very most well-known names in the popular music field. And each one of them would have like one line: we are the world, we are the children. That's what it was. And then the next person would sing in the next. And I watched the video and I enjoyed it. I mean, these are people with a lot of energy, but I was so amused by the effort that so many of them put in, and how much of their efforts would go into the medulla. And you would see them and their heads would be tossing, and they'd have their head back, and then their whole body would be clenched, and they'd be trying to get this energy out because this was their moment to sing their song. And they did, and they sang it, and it was great. I mean, for what they were trying to do, they did it really well. But this is the exact opposite. Well, when you would watch Swami Kriyananda sing, it's like he did nothing he just would open his mouth and sing. There would be no tension in the medulla, there'd be no clenching of the fists, there'd be no waving of the arms. Just, he would be virtually motionless, except for whatever the voice was coming through, because he was attuned to this greater power. He didn't have to squeeze it through his individual ego. And paradoxically, the more we relax and just let ourselves be one with that, it's the ego that takes so much tension. The ego is like a little submersible vessel in the bottom of the ocean, and there's this tremendous pressure of the ocean that's trying to break through that little submarine, and the submarine has to be very strong to hold that whole ocean at bay. And in fact, and that's the divine force, is always trying to fill us with its greater freedom, and we're working so hard to maintain our separateness. And so the tension is to maintain separateness. And when realization comes and we understand that all that security and power and happiness that we were seeking actually comes from receiving that divine energy instead of defining ourselves in such a limited way, then this tremendous power comes through us, but also this relaxation. And so this is where Swami talks about, even though you could feel his tremendous power of attunement with the whole universe in Master, there was also lightness there, because there was no self. There was no limited self to claim it. And this is the paradoxes to the human mind. Just how light and free, how power, divine power, brings with us this very light-hearted, childlike spirit. And then in the rest of the next two paragraphs, then Swami just talks about how masters, and I believe I told that same story, perhaps even just yesterday, but how the presence of the master outside the building where Swami was sleeping, as he writes about here, was so powerful that it brought him out of subconsciousness into superconsciousness. He was asleep, and then all of a sudden he woke up with this energy, the superconscious energy, and so he began to meditate. But then he realized that what was happening was that Master was nearby. So he slips out and just imagine, as a disciple, realizing, Swami's just a young man now, 22, 23, and he realizes, what an extraordinary gift has been given to him in his good karma to have become a disciple. So he can't contain himself. He rushes out to touch Master's feet. So that's the story on one side of this incredible power. And now, not in the moment, but Swami says later, Master says to him, because Master's just walking around outside, he thinks everyone is asleep. All of a sudden, Swami comes slipping out of the house and crouches at his feet. So Master jokingly says, I thought I was seeing a ghost. Now, Master had a personality, and he had human experiences, and maybe for a moment he didn't know what he was seeing. But there's the lightness. On one hand, there's so much power that it wakes Swami from subconsciousness into superconsciousness. And on the other hand, Master just makes a joke about it. Instead of saying, "Lo, I cometh, and, my chosen feel my arrival." I mean, these are the bad movies that we've all seen. And these are the sort of pretend spiritual people that just, not necessarily out of malice, but just sort of trying to understand how they're supposed to behave, if there's a self to think about it. But on Master's side, it was just, yes, the power is there. And so also is this lightness. And the lightness is, I thought you were a ghost, instead of, yes, my son. But when Swami did kneel at Master's feet, Master understood and responded in kind. In that moment, Master was acting as was appropriate to act, which is the divine spirit was flowing. Swami had been able to receive it. Master continued in that. And then later, he brings in the lightness, lest we all take ourselves too seriously. So from the point of view of how we ourselves can live like Master, we should definitely not try to put on the accoutrements of it. But Swamiji has always told us, pay attention to the sound of your voice. Listen to the sound of your voice. If necessary, record it, but that's going a little farther than we need. What he's really talking about is, where are we speaking from? Are we speaking from the tension of the medulla and the tension of the throat and the desire to be heard? Are we speaking from the relaxation, just relaxing into the reality of this world and allowing the sound of the voice to emanate also from the heart? I mean, what is the consciousness with which we speak? I remember this funny exchange I had once. Sometimes with Swamiji, he would offer the most serious comments at a time when you didn't expect it. I was sitting at the dinner table. I have this table that you can put 4 leaves in and you can expand it. And when Swamiji would come to visit, there were often a lot of people there. And sometimes we'd have we could put 16 around that dinner table. And often we had 16 around the dinner table. I think at this point there were only 10 or 12. We were in the middle of, Swamiji would often use our house to, he would bring people from Ananda village or gather people from other places, and sort of everybody being out of their context, it was a good atmosphere for creative thinking because everyone could just be focused and relaxed, and we would host. And there was some discussion happening about some issue having to do with publications, and there were a lot of ideas going around the table, and I thought I had a real brainwave that I wanted to share. But everybody was talking, and I just couldn't get my idea out, and it seemed important to me. So humorously, I sort of interrupted, and I said in the voice like this, "Listen to me, listen to me, listen to me." Just like that. I mean, you have to understand, this is like a family dinner table. So this is like, the kid's sister can just say something like that and everybody understands. So everybody laughed, and, they were quiet and they were going to listen to me. But Swamiji, very, very seriously, he just looked at me so sweetly. He was sitting right next to me. He said, "Asha, we always listen to you." Just like that. Now, there was something in it for me, of course, and it laughed, and it turned out my idea was actually really terrible, and so the whole thing just sort of went on its own way. But I thought later about that a lot because it came out so differently than I expected. And I thought, oh my, how much of one's life, including my own, do we spend just tensely hoping that things are going to come out right for us? And all of that sounds in our voice and in the way we present ourselves and in the way we hold our body. Whereas Master was just calmly, totally resting. He was just resting in the reality of his oneness with God. Now, we can't manufacture that realization, but we can at least wean ourselves from that constant tension about where I fit in this universe. And before we express ourselves, especially before we express ourselves in a way that's very important, that matters to us, but actually everything always matters. Just take that moment to just ask ourselves, am I standing on the edge, anxious about whether I'm going to be heard? Or am I resting in my heart? I'm resting at the spiritual eye, resting in my inner self with the calm and the sure knowledge that Divine Mother is with me, that Master is with me. I mean, just take that moment to attune ourselves. Master was effortlessly attuned. He didn't have to stop and try to make himself, now for this moment, I better tune in. That was sort of Jesus straining and sweating to turn the water into wine. He didn't have to do that. He just rested in the heart of his own relationship to the infinite power, and then allowed that power to flow through. That's what we're doing. We don't have to conjure it. We just have to stop blocking it. Most of the time with our tension, you see, we keep it at bay. And then our body language and our voice reflects that tension. Whereas what we really want to be is to just rest in the heart. And then from that awareness of the universal presence, then we speak. But then, as Swami says, even in that power, there's also a certain lightness in it, because that's also how we feel. When we find ourselves at rest and in attunement with that divine presence, it's like all the things that we've been reaching for with so much tension, we suddenly discover that we're holding them at all times. Happiness is our natural condition when we let go of all the limiting beliefs that keep us from knowing that. I want this, I have to have this, I'm anxious about that. And then humility again, also. We don't feel, we don't have to become humble by suppressing our strengths. We become humble by recognizing that we are all, this is who we all are. We are all the same in the presence of God. We are just resting in that reality. Again, in this book I was reading about Ananda Mohima, it's a small book by Swami Mangalananda, Acharya Mangalananda. It's called A Goddess with Us, I think. I hope that's the right name. Yeah, I'll have to make sure tomorrow that I have it. A Goddess with Us, I think is what it's called. She said that often Ma was crowded, people crowded around her. And then someone said, do you mind all these people always crowding around you? She said, when your hand brushes against your leg, do you feel that something has happened to you? She said, I look at everyone and everyone is myself. She said, she didn't explain, but another person brushing up against her is just like her own hand brushing against her own leg. And it was an extraordinary state of consciousness that she lived. But it also tells us in a direction, that we can begin to see the world and to experience the world well. We should live as Yogananda lived, in relaxed understanding and acceptance of our oneness with the divine. God bless you.